last few weeks, you've seen many images from the civil rights movement, from its history. It's my hope that these images have become familiar to you, that you can now recognize many or perhaps all of the faces and characters involved, and certainly the events that these images portray or show. It's important to remember, when we look at images like this, they are real. This was something that took me quite a while to understand. The civil rights movement is non-fiction. All of these events are true. This is especially puzzling when we consider just how unkind people had been, just how alien people's behavior made them appear, like that angry woman behind Elizabeth Eckford in the image you see up on the screen, or that poor misguided man holding up a Confederate flag in the image on the bottom left, a symbol of hatred for many people in the country. I'd like to revisit this moment in civil rights history, one of the most important, the crisis in Little Rock. It's very strange for me to look at images, newsreels, news footage from 1957. It's unusual for me to think that these were real events. It's so dramatic, and the issue is very difficult to understand for me. After all, who could be against integration? I want you to see some of the images again. I'm going to share with you an interview with Ernest Green. He was one of the Little Rock Nine. He spoke to a journalist with the Associated Press, or AP, many years after the events that are shown in the video and in the video you saw yesterday. I want you to listen very carefully to some of the ways that Mr. Green describes his feelings in his experience in 1957. You're also going to see and hear two other characters that we've discussed, Governor Faubus and President Eisenhower. I'll talk to you in a little bit about what I think about what just happened. Pay close attention. I think you'll learn something new.
The local newspaper, the Arkansas Gazette at that time, indicated that the Brown decision was going to change the face of the South forever. I remember those words. And I thought to myself, good, because I think the face of the South ought to change.
I will not force my people to integrate against their will.
The governor of the state, Orville Faubus, decided that he was going to use Central as his point of resistance. None of us of the nine anticipated that the resistance would be as strong as it was. The night before we were to go to school, the governor called out the Arkansas National Guard, unbeknownst to us. And when we appeared at Central the first day,
sealed off.
The National Guard was there to bar our entrance and let white students go into the school. What it was like, it was rejection that I had never experienced like that. When we got home from school that day, did we realize what an ordeal, personal ordeal, Elizabeth had gone through, and that she certainly faced more of the mob directly. I always applaud the fact that she was able to keep both her composure and try to figure out how to get out of that. We started school on the 25th of September.
President Eisenhower sends 500 troops of the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army.
It was a terrific feeling that the President of the United States would send troops to escort us into school. I didn't know what was going to happen after that. It was like going to war every day.
Well, what did you think? I noticed a few things. Did you notice the way that Ernest Green described his feelings? At the beginning, it sounded like he was quite hopeful. You notice he said the face of the South ought to change, and he thought that he was going to be part of that change. Only later did he realize that the governor, unbeknownst to him, as he said, had sent troops. He later realized that he would experience rejection like he had never felt before. That the governor was using this as a way of staging resistance, Mr. Green called it. The governor was using these students' lives and using this moment in history to resist integration and the change that he so longed for, Mr. Green. But notice that he also described a terrific feeling when the national troops arrived. Despite all of the discomfort that he experienced along the way, he felt it was terrific, as he said, to know that, in a way, the President of the United States had his back. He later learned that Elizabeth Eckford experienced some of the worst moments on those first few days. She seems to have borne the brunt of it, as the saying goes. What did you notice about the other two characters? Did you pay close attention to Governor Faubus? He's quite interesting. He's smiling for the cameras. I hope you noticed some of the things he said. It's very subtle. This is what I noticed. He said that he didn't think that integration should be forced in Arkansas, as he said, against the will of the people. Now this is very interesting. He's saying that the people of Arkansas didn't want integration. But which people was he talking about? You see, he conveniently left out any of the black people in Arkansas. He was only talking about white folks. There's something else interesting about that statement. Do you notice that he didn't say what he feels about segregation or integration? I mean, we don't need to think much about that. We know for a fact that he was a strong supporter of segregation. He was against the Little Rock Nine joining the school. That's not the issue. In his statement, he took no responsibility for what he was doing. He simply said he was doing the will of the people. This is an argument that governors around the South and in some other places in the North used to support segregation. We shouldn't be fooled by it for a minute. Even supposing that everybody in Arkansas, black and white, did want segregation. It's not true, but even if that were true, the courts had already spoken. The Supreme Court had already said that integration needed to begin. Governor Faubus was breaking the law, pure and simple. Now, there was one other character there, President Eisenhower. What you just saw were a few excerpts, or a few moments, from a speech he gave to the entire nation. Television was a fairly new technology, but it gave the president a great power. He was able to interrupt evening programming if he had to address a terrible crisis. He chose to do so in 1957. That's how strongly he felt about this crisis. He thought that it was setting a very bad example of one governor taking the law into his own hands. What you saw is what many people across the country saw as they tuned in 1957 in September. It was a powerful image. The most powerful man in the country was standing up for integration. The 50s started a time of great momentum for civil rights. The Brown decision and the Montgomery bus boycott showed that integration was on the move, but it met resistance in 1957 in places like Little Rock, Arkansas. But finally, despite all the resistance, the federal government was willing to step up for civil rights. I want to look back at our baseball metaphor once more, but this time I want you to do all the talking. You can either think everything through if you'd like, but it would be even better if you could find somebody around you, and I want you to tell them about our crazy game of integration baseball, who are the players of the two teams, and describe the events that you see. I'll stay quiet. It'll be up to you. Here we go. Here's your chance. Tell the world about what you know. How did you do? Were you able to get all 3 bases? I'm sure you were able to explain that only one thing remained. Jim Crow had to go. That would be the final way to home plate. I'll bet you can describe the inference you were able to make. Go ahead, say it out loud, or tell somebody around you. What can you infer about the process of integration when you think about these 3 events? Integration was a slow process, and it happened one small step at a time. The federal government still had done little or nothing in some states to begin integrating public places outside of schools, such as buses, hospitals, and businesses. The next step would involve great sacrifice. We would need new tactics, new ways of going about this, new ways of spreading integration. We're going to discuss 2 forms of protest today. We've already seen how the boycott was a peaceful protest that involved moving against a business, trying to persuade it to change its ways by not using its services. Today we're going to discuss 2 things. One called a sit-in, a form of protest, and the other called the Freedom Ride. As we discuss these 2 forms of peaceful protest, you're going to see that the hound dog of segregation was fighting back in an even more fearsome way than ever before. The struggle for integration needed new tactics, new ideas, new actions. Supporters of segregation were becoming increasingly violent. What would the civil rights movement do? Would it return violent actions for violent actions? Well, let's find out. I'd like you to read this chapter quietly to yourself. It's important to me that you try to read along without hearing a voice from time to time. It's good exercise. You can read the chapter on the screen or read it in today's lesson pages. We'll come back together in about 5 minutes. If you need more time, go ahead and pause the video. I hope you enjoyed that short chapter. Let's discuss what you learned and add some details to your growing knowledge. Sit-ins were a new kind of peaceful protest, but it's important to remember they were meant to be peaceful. How did it all get started? Monday, February 1st, 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 black students entered Woolworth's department store. They sat down at the lunch counter. Department stores in those days often served food. The waitress refused to serve them. Like every restaurant in Greensboro, Woolworth's lunch counter was segregated. Unlike Montgomery's buses, however, the lunch counter did not have separate seating for black people. Hardly could we call this separate but equal. There was no there to be equal. It had no seating for black people at all. Woolworth's 5 and dime store sold goods to black and white people, but its lunch counter served only white people. The 4 young men sat there all afternoon. They were never served. When they finally left, they promised to be back at 10 o'clock the next morning to continue their sit-down protest against segregation. I'll bet already you've noticed a pattern. These gentlemen were acting in a way unlike the people who had orchestrated or led the Montgomery bus boycott. Did you catch that? How is that? How is this different? They're both peaceful. There's the catch. In a boycott, people refuse to use a service in order to change the business. But in the sit-in, they were trying to use the service, a service that they were entitled to use. They had a right to be there as much as anyone else, and yet they were refused service. They continued to come back. Do you see the difference? If a boycott means staying away from a business to change it, a sit-in was a way of trying to use that business in order to change it. Interesting, isn't it? That night, telephone lines buzzed. More students wanted to join them. Even some white students from Greensboro College wanted to sit in. They too disliked segregation. Student leaders organized the new recruits. By Tuesday morning, 19 more students joined the first 4. By Wednesday, 85 students were taking turns sitting in. They arranged their lunch counter sit-in shifts so that they could also attend classes. Devoted students that they were. The white managers of the Greensboro Woolworths did not know how to respond. What should they do? At first, they did not have the young people arrested. No. By the end of the first week, however, the sit-in had attracted hundreds of eager students. They began sitting in at Cress, another big downtown store. That's when the hound dog emerged. Angry white crowds surrounded the sit-in protesters. Some attacked the students. They poured ketchup over the students' heads. They even burned the students with lighted cigarettes. The image that you see here, this primary document, shows students, black and white, peaceful protesters, having food dumped on their heads. What did you learn in your reading? What was the first rule of a good sit-in? I bet you remember. Don't react. Be peaceful. Remain calm. That's exactly what these students are doing. Despite the abuse, the food launched at them, the insults hurled at them across the place, and eventually they would even be attacked, they remained calm. They were simply trying to show that they had a right, that all people had an equal right to enjoy the services of these businesses. At first, police stood by and watched. Then they arrested the polite, well-dressed young students. They did not arrest the white tormentors. That means they didn't arrest the people who were abusing the sit-in protesters. Black college students, the pride and joy of their law-abiding families, were hauled off to jails across the South. I'd like you to take a quick moment, a moment to stretch. We'll visit this in a few moments afterwards. The civil rights movement was changing. New forms of protest were now needed. New ways to capture the imagination of people across the country. New ways to spread the message that integration was something good and something that was needed. Sit-ins were one new tactic, one new way of showing the world the message of civil rights. This image shows people peacefully trying to take advantage of a business, trying to use the services that should have been available to everyone. And here they are being abused by people around them. This was the hound dog of segregation, being stubborn and being unpleasant as usual. One thing it reveals is that supporters of segregation were starting to feel insecure. Supporters of integration and civil rights were gaining momentum. Their message was getting heard. The civil rights hound dog, the segregation hound dog, was now biting back more fiercely than ever. It had already shown the world how vicious it could be. The threats that it had issued, the taunts, the cruel actions, the illegal actions, the racist symbols, the hateful shouts, the wailing mobs. The sit-ins was just to show one more way of protesting this kind of behavior. And the hound dog acted in a way that we would expect it to. Angrily, in an ugly way. There's one more form of protest that I'd like to look at, and this is one that's bound very closely to the hound dog. Take a look at this primary source. This map shows something called the Freedom Rides. It's routes across the states of the south and central part of the country, through Missouri, Arkansas, and up into the northeast. You've read about the Freedom Rides. You read about them in the chapter at the beginning of this lesson. But let's look at what this document reveals. Look at the key. Look at the legend. It's a map. It shows us a route. It shows us the direction that these Freedom Rides went. But what else does it reveal? What do those stars mean? Along the way, the Freedom Riders, whoever they were, faced violence. And what of those boxes? 9 arrested, May 17th, 306 jailed, 3 jailed, 2 arrested, 1 jailed. These protesters were also arrested by the police of these various states. What exactly were the Freedom Riders? What were they trying to achieve? And why is it they were met with such violence? Some of the people inspired by the college student sit-ins decided to take action against continuing segregation in public transportation. That's right, the very buses that the Montgomery bus boycott was trying to change. They knew that southern states insisted on separate seating, restrooms, restaurants, and waiting rooms for blacks and whites. They also knew that more than a dozen years earlier, the Supreme Court had ruled this segregation illegal. And yet, here they were, the states, still insisting on these terrible ways. They decided to take the radical or extreme action of following the law laid down by the Supreme Court. You see, they weren't breaking any laws. They were simply doing what the court had said they can already do. 13 men and women gathered in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1961. They came to begin training as Freedom Riders, as they would come to be known as. Their ages ranged from 21 to 60. Among them were students, a professor, a folk singer, a preacher, and a writer. Some were black, and some were white, a sign that the civil rights movement was starting to gain allies outside of the black community, people who recognized that they should be on the right side of history. The Freedom Riders had a very simple goal or objective. They wanted to show that anyone should enjoy the buses that travel between states. It was the court's ruling. There was nothing that should stop anyone of any color from using this simple service. The Freedom Riders rode Greyhound and Trailways buses, two companies that were famous at the time and still today for Greyhound. They rode these buses some 1,500 miles from Washington, D.C., all the way to New Orleans. Some white members of the group rode in the back of the bus. Some black members of the group rode in the front. Do you see what they were trying to do? Some black and white Freedom Riders sat together. They ignored white and colored signs on restrooms and waiting rooms. It was their way of saying segregation was wrong. They were going to defy it. But not the law. The law, you see, was on their side. Then, on the morning of May 6th, the violence began. The hound dog was baring its teeth. These are powerful images. The hound dog was striking back in a terrifying way. On May 4th, 1961, the first day of their 13 journey, everything went well. Some people glared angrily at the mixed-race group, but no one bothered them. On May 5th, they were turned away from the waiting room in one town. The next morning, however, the bus stopped at the Greyhound station in Rock Hill, South Carolina. John Lewis, a 21-year-old student, walked toward the white waiting room. Two young white men stepped in front of him. They told him to go to the colored entrance. Lewis refused. "I have a right to go here, because of the Supreme Court," he said. The white men attacked him. The driver started up the engine, heading out of town as fast as he could go. A long trail of cars pursued or followed the bus. As its slashed tires went flat, the bus stopped at the side of the road. The driver ran away into the fields. You see, angry white protesters had slashed this bus, slashed its tires in order to stop it, because they knew the Freedom Riders were on board. Now the mob surrounded the bus, smashing windows. When someone threw a firebomb through the broken back window, the mob blocked the door. They were trying to set this on fire. They were trying to explode the bus by using a bomb. A desperate state police officer inside the bus forced the mob to open the door. Choking on smoke, he and the passengers stumbled out. More state troopers arrived. They drove the mob away from the injured Freedom Riders. The police then took the Freedom Riders to the Anniston Hospital. Their bravery and their suffering captured the attention of the country. Furthermore, because so many news reporters were attacked by the angry white mobs, the Freedom Riders' story was well reported. What began as a peaceful protest, a way of defying not the law, but the illegal actions of bus companies, brought out the worst of the segregation hound dog. Violent actions against the peaceful protesters. But as you saw from that image, the map, it was reported on widely across the country. People across the country followed the story and the journey of the Freedom Riders with great interest, in part because the people reporting on them were themselves often injured. This was the hound dog acting in a most gruesome way. I think we're ready to add this to our timeline. Let's add it. The year is 1961, the beginning of two new kinds of protest. Sit-ins and freedom rides capture the nation's attention about civil rights. Think about that word, capture. People couldn't take their eyes off of what they were seeing. Television and newspapers were bringing them the story of the Freedom Riders and the sit-ins. Such dramatic moments. Even people who never thought about civil rights were forced to confront it as they saw the images and read the reports in the newspaper and on television. It was capturing the nation's attention and spreading the word about civil rights. Add this to your paper, write it neatly, and but keep that paper safe. As you can see, we have 4 more events to add to it. We've been able to see that this was yet one more step. We can infer from these events that integration was a slow process that happened one small step at a time. You demonstrated that when you described our baseball metaphor. There's more to it, though. As more people took action to promote or help along integration, some supporters of segregation, think of the hound dog, supporters took violent action of their own. Another way of thinking about it, the supporters of segregation were becoming increasingly violent. There's a very powerful adverb there, increasingly violent. As more and more people across the country were hearing the message about civil rights, the most stubborn of segregation supporters were becoming desperate. On the other hand, many common people were starting to feel more strongly about civil rights. They felt very powerful emotions in favor of the sit-in protesters and the freedom riders. They were starting to see that integration made sense, and one thing that definitely did not make sense was the violent ways that segregation supporters were adopting. The violence of segregation made no sense to many people. What did make sense was the need for integration and an end to the violence. But we can add one other thing to our powerful inference. Integration was not only a slow process, it was a painful process, and it demanded great sacrifices from civil rights fighters. There were many obstacles that people in the civil rights movement would need to overcome.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Deep in my heart, oh, deep in my heart, I do believe, I do believe we shall overcome someday.